Yeah, what is Dangerous Liaisons? I mean, people might think it's a film. It isn't. It's a booklet that is actually aimed at uh, trying to encourage women in the trade union movement principally to become involved and become active in the unions. Although we're 55% of the membership, we're still at best only 40% of union members, women, are actually active in the union and in their union. So that's an area we need to particularly address in terms of trying to encourage more women to become active. It isn't something new. It's been a long history of that, and something that really came to me when I was actually reading a booklet called Dare to be Free. It was produced by the Mary Quayle Club and the Working Class Movement Library up in Manchester. And it was a lovely book all about Mary Quayle, who's a brilliant activist. And at the back of it, there were these profiles of some women activists in the Northwest region. One of whom was Sarah Woolley, who's now a General Secretary of Papawu. And I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to actually have something like this for the Eastern region, for in the East, because we're a very scattered area, and it's very difficult for women in the movement to actually get the support and the networking to encourage being involved and staying involved in union activity. I thought, yeah, it's a great pity, but then I thought, well, if we haven't got something, why don't I do something about it? Why don't I write something? And then it was a case of really what to write. I love history and I love the trade union movement, so that, in a sense, seemed a way in of actually researching more about the history of women in the trade union movement, and then having some profiles at the back instead of it being about one person. And when I started to do it, and started doing the research, I realized that what little I did actually know, because there is so much there that has never actually been recorded in terms of publications. I mean, I've got the centenary book from the TUC, and the number of times that women are actually mentioned in the whole first 100 years of the TUC is twice. And that amounts to a couple of photographs of Mary MacArthur and the NFWW, and a photograph of some bank clerks actually picketing one of the, I think it was Barclays Bank, during the bank workers' strike. And that's it. That's as far as the TUC at that time, 50 years ago, thought that was all that's actually involved. The reality is very, very different. I mean, the role that women have actually played in the movement, going right back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and certainly 200 years ago. I'm sure everybody's seen the film Peterloo. And the fact that women were particularly involved there, and that the female reform societies, but that really comes out of the fact that women were actively involved in the textile unions right at the beginning of the 19th century, and right the way through, basically. I mean, they were mixed unions and women were very strongly involved. The problem for outside of the textile industry is that while women were coming more and more into industry, the craft unions particularly didn't want women to be involved. And if we go to the 1875 TUC Congress, which was the first Congress when there were 2 women delegates at that Congress for the very first time, there was a speech from the Secretary of the Parliamentary Committee, Henry Broadhurst, in which he was urging Congress to actually ensure that wives and daughters were in their proper sphere at home and not competing with the great and powerful men for work. And that was the attitude, particularly of the trade union movement. And it was forcing women who were getting involved in areas such as the main sort of craft areas for women, areas such as millinery and upholstery and so on, were forming their own small unions, and they'd already been formed the Women's Protective and Provident League, which later became the Women's Trade Unions League, to try and organise that. But women were having to very much organise outside of the trade union movement, which was still very much dominated by the craft unions. There was no basic general union movement at that time for low and unskilled workers, until 1888, when I'm sure we've all heard of the Brian to May watch workers strike, that the significance there was the fact that not that women had gone on strike, because that had been happening for some time and there had been other strikes, but it was the first time by any organised unskilled workers to actually come together and not just go on strike, but to actually successfully campaign in terms of changing the conditions at work and their pay and so on. And this was a very significant strike because Bryant and May were one of the major companies in the country at that time. If you can think back to them, matches were extremely important because your heating, your lighting and everything was dominated by solid fuels or oils and things like that. So you had to have a match to cook something, to just put the lights on and so on, to heat your home. So it's a major company, and to have actually organised as they did, and these were young women and girls between the ages of 13 and 20 in the East End of London in Bow. And it shook the foundations. Ben Tillett, who you probably remember because he was actually the organiser of the infamous dock workers strike, the dock workers tanner, which gets massive publicity in the histories of the trade union movement. He accepted that that wouldn't have been possible, and that it was because of the match women that out of that came the whole movement which produced the new unionism that developed at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century and actually led to the foundation of the Labour Party. So in terms of looking at all that, I really felt that what the booklet needed to do was and what we needed was something which got across to so many women that in fact there's a lot of achievement that has actually gone on over those last 150 years or so to get to where we are today. When we look at the period at the beginning of the 20th century and the Great Unrest, the women were very much in the forefront of that. When Mary MacArthur became involved, when she came down to London in 1903, she's a member of the Shop Assistants Union and she became secretary of the Women's Trade Union League. And she actually looked at the situation then, and there were strikes happening all over the place, and women were coming out on strike and demanding a living wage and equal pay. But there was no organisation. That's one of the big problems that she actually saw, that there were small unions here and there, and it was impossible very often to actually maintain a strike and actually win it. All the employer had to do was hold out for a few weeks and they'd be forced back to work through starvation. And it was particularly in terms of one strike, which was in Dundee, which she went up to. She was called in by the local trades council. This was quite often happening. The trades councils were calling for Mary MacArthur to come in and to actually support women. So there was a lot of support there from male trade unionists for what was growing at that time. But that strike, when she got up there, it was impossible to actually continue the strike. And it was really that she advised them to actually form a union branch and go back into work. But she was standing on the day they went back in a snowstorm at 6 o'clock in the morning as they went into work. And that's when she really came up with the belief that what was needed was separate trade union for women, a national trade union, where women could actually, not just those that couldn't actually get involved in trades because they weren't being admitted, but it was an opportunity for women to actually come in and learn about trade union organisation and develop the skills, with the idea that eventually the women would actually be able to play a full and equal part in the trade union movement along with the men. And that eventually did happen. It was never a very big organisation, a maximum of 80,000 members. But despite its size and the fact it only existed for 15 years, it organised more women, fought more strikes, won more battles, and did more to establish women's trade unionism than any other organisation before or since. It was a major event and a major turning point. Sadly, of course, Mary MacArthur died at the age of 40, and quite suddenly. She was diagnosed in the April of 1920 with terminal cancer, and she died actually on the 1st of January 1921, the day that the NFWW, the National Federation of Women Workers, merged with the National Union of General Workers, which is now the GMB. But that really said that although it had established what happened after that, as we all know, that gradually there was the recession, the post-First World War recession. Many women had lost their jobs after they'd been in the wartime industries, and the women's involvement in the trade union movement decreased because basically the trade union membership was decreasing, and unions were more about holding on to their members than actually developing. And this, apart from the civil service unions, where there was still a battle around equal pay and fighting the marriage bar, it wasn't really until nearly another 50 years when we came to the big strike, I think is the watershed in women's history. And the booklet actually evolves itself around that very issue, which I think you all know what I'm going to say, which was the sewing machinists at Dagenham. And the film, of course, that was made of that, well, it was the film that took the two strikes, the 68 and the 84 one, and combined them into one event. But it was a brilliant film that actually recorded so much of the issues. And I'm sure those of us, those like Sylvia as well, and anyone who was involved in the trade union movement in the 70s and 80s, particularly, and in the 60s as well, will remember that when looking at it, there's so much in there that you actually could feel and link with in terms of what was happening. Because just as there've been earlier on, although there's been many cases where men have actually supported women in terms of the trade union movement, there was still a lot of hostility. There was at best indifference quite often. It was shown up in the first of those strikes. There was the one male shop steward that was inspiring it, but the main leadership of the union at Fords of Dagenham just didn't take the women seriously, and they got an almost shock when the women came out on strike. And the result of that, where the Equal Pay Act of 1970 came in, which was a totally flawed act. I mean, it was a dreadful act. It gave the employers 5 years to find every possible way they could around avoiding paying equal pay. And it wasn't until 84 and the amendments from the European Union that was forced upon the governments of equal value. But it was very significant in the sense that it really sparked, along with the growth of the women's liberation movement at that time, a whole new trade unionism. And those of us that were really involved in the 70s and 80s will remember the amount that we actually achieved there as well, which had built upon what had been happening elsewhere around the United Nations and the development of equal rights for women. And if it hadn't been for basically the Thatcher government and then the Reagan government and the development of this first viral pandemic of neoliberalism, that we would be in a far better position, a much more equal position today than we are now. But and that's really where I came in and wanting to do something. It was dreadful to see, and I'm sure, again, Sylvia, I'm sure you would think this as well, that the gains that had actually been made over all that period were starting to be whittled away by the employers and the government, by reducing the general employment rights at work and union rights was particularly affecting women. And then when you look at the last 10 years or so of the so-called austerity, which again has so impacted on women in the movement and in society generally, and made it so much more difficult. And when I look now, and I'm particularly having retired and moved to Wisbech and seeing so many women that are in so many jobs where they're in the precarious types of employment, on 0 hours contracts, on low pay, being totally undervalued, intimidated. There's very little difference to what Mary MacArthur was actually experiencing 100 or so years ago. And when she used the words, women are badly paid because of their unorganized condition, and they remain unorganized mainly because they're badly paid, that applies to hundreds of thousands of women today. And that's what I'm trying with this booklet to do, is we need to find ways in which we can encourage more women into the movement. We need to make the trade union movement more responsive to women, that we're going to increase not only the number of women being active, but actually being able to become leaders in the union. We have the lovely phrase, a woman's place is in the union. We add now, a woman's place is leading a union. But I've just gone through a ballot for the election of our General Secretary. And yes, we've now got a woman leading the largest trade union of over 1 million women for the first time. And it's taken a long time to get there. But the ballot choice was there were 4 candidates. And we've got a union which is over 75% women. And yet 75% of the candidates for General Secretary were men. And it doesn't take much to see the dissonance between the two and the problems that are still there, that we have a lot to do. We have a lot more to do. I hope this is a booklet. I've had quite a lot. It hasn't been launched yet because I'd intended to launch it last year to connect with the 50th anniversary of the passing of the Equal Pay Act. The pandemic's got in the way of that and really has to, although I've got it now, actually got it finally published in hardback form. It's a case of when can we really launch, because so many union offices are actually shut and distributing it is difficult. I've got nearly 500 copies. I've got about 450 copies still of this to go out, but we will be launching hopefully over the summer. If nothing goes wrong with the pandemic and the relaxing of controls and people getting back to work, then perhaps it will be a time when we can actually launch it.